Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Foreign Policy Panel and World Affairs Today program, ISIL, Response and Repercussions. On August 19th, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant thrust itself into the global forefront with the beheading of American journalist James Foley. The group had been active in the Syrian civil war with the opposition rebels, but broke away, taking advantage of political instability in Iraq to begin to claim large areas and establish an Islamic State. The beheading of an American journalist has evoked a military response from the United States, which is now engaged with a coalition of partners to strike ISIL strongpoints in Syria and Iraq. This evening's panel will seek to illuminate what ISIL is, what its motivations and actions are, and the U.S. and coalition response. Finally, what impact does this have for the region at large? Joining us this evening is Thomas Sanderson, co-director and senior fellow at the Transnational Threats Project at CSIS. From 2004 to 2009, he led the CSIS open source counterterrorism project. He also co-directed a project on the geopolitical implications of the U.S. Northern Distribution Network and another of the Central Asian terrorists operating between the Fergana Valley and South Waziristan. He has authored and co-authored numerous major CSIS public reports, and his opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Economist, and Washington Post. I welcome back Dr. Shadi Hamid who is a former speaker. He is a fellow with the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World and the Center for the Middle East Policy at Brookings Institution. He previously served as Director of Research at Brookings Doha Center. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Hamid was Director of Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy. He is the author of Temptations of Power, Islamist and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Moderating tonight's panel is Kate Brannen, Senior Reporter for Foreign Policy, covering the defense industry and the Pentagon. Prior to joining Foreign Policy, Ms. Brannen was a defense reporter for Politico, authoring the daily national security newsletter, Morning Defense. She previously was a congressional reporter for Defense News and spent 3 years covering the U.S. Army. She has reported from military bases across the country and has interviewed senior leadership at the Pentagon and State Department. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. It's a real pleasure, and it also provides a great opportunity to sort of step back from my daily reporting and think about some of the bigger questions that are driving the debate around this topic right now. I don't get to do that often, so I'm looking forward to it. And in preparing for tonight, I tried to think about when the Islamic State, which I should say now, it goes by many names. At Foreign Policy, we've decided to call them the Islamic State. The administration calls them ISIL. And ISIS, though, kind of seems to be the name that's stuck for a lot of people. So if I call them the Islamic State, it's because I'm stuck in FP style guide. But anyway, so the Islamic State, I was thinking about when it sort of first crossed public consciousness here in the United States. And for me as well, when they first sort of came onto my own radar. As a reporter covering the Pentagon, it seems like they've been around forever and we've been bombing them for a long time when it's only been 8 weeks. But very quickly the terms sort of sneak into your lingo and your dialogue and you start throwing them around as if they've been around for a long time. But the truth is they're fairly new to me and they're fairly new to the American public as well. So this question too of sort of when did we know about them and how much did we know has seems to be driving the debate this week, following President Obama's appearance on 60 Minutes on Sunday. He acknowledged the fact that the intelligence community was surprised by the Islamic State's advance into Iraq earlier this year, which was met with sort of immediate blowback from the intelligence community saying, no, 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 we've been tracking these guys for longer. And there was a story out in the New York Times today that implied that it was the White House that had been ignoring warnings on the Islamic State, and that their threat was well known at least as far back as this winter and maybe this fall, or last fall, I should say. So anyway, I thought with this opening I would try to provide some context for who is the Islamic State, where do they come from, and what has been the U.S. response to them so far. So in addressing the who is the Islamic State, where they come from question, there's a debate about how far back in history you want to go to decide this is the starting point. This is where the seeds were planted for this group. And in Washington, that question can quickly become a blame game. Which administration is responsible for the Islamic State? Was it the Bush administration? Was it the Obama administration? Where do you want to begin with? Where did they come from? But as far as I could tell, for the most part, most timelines and most analysis of this group go back as least as far as the invasion of Iraq under the Bush administration and some of the policies that were quickly implemented after U.S. forces arrived in Baghdad. And the first is the Bush administration's decision to disband the Iraqi military, and then the decision, the de-Baathification policy, which basically pushed out anybody affiliated with the regime of Saddam Hussein, had to immediately leave government and was ostracized. This created all sorts of anti-American feelings, stigmatism for the Sunni people of Iraq, and there wasn't buy-in to this new government that was created. So I'll leave that there in terms of how that feeds into what later became ISIS. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq before that, but they moved in after the fact and created a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, feeding off of this dissatisfaction on the part of Sunnis. We are very familiar sort of with what happened during Iraq during that period. Violence escalated. This was met with a surge of U.S. troops in 2006, and many Sunni tribes were sort of paid off to help force Al-Qaeda out of Iraq. The next sort of turning point is when the U.S. left Iraq in 2011. And again, you'll hear on Capitol Hill, this is sort of the decisive moment for a lot of Republicans who are critical of the Obama administration. This is the decision that really created this group, in that the U.S. military left, the Iraqi security forces maybe weren't ready for their training wheels to come off, so to say, and a lot of our intelligence assets also left the country at that time after the military pulled out. So I will leave 2011 there, because at the same time, in the spring of 2011, the Syrian uprising began with protests against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. These, after Assad met these with a violent response, this escalated and eventually turned into a civil war that's engulfed the country. It's lasted over 3 years. In the meantime, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was severely diminished in Iraq by the U.S. military, but it wasn't defeated entirely. And so when the Syrian civil war turns violent, turns chaotic, Al-Qaeda in Iraq moves into Syria to take advantage of this situation and sort of feeds off of the violence there. At this point, it rebrands itself, let me get this right, I think it rebranded itself earlier as the Islamic State in Iraq, and then when it moves into Syria, it becomes the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, which is where the ISIL comes from. Its new leader is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and under his authority, they make advances in Syria. They're able to take Raqqa, which they've since made their headquarters. Around this time, Al-Qaeda decides they don't want anything to do with this group, or they decide to break off with it. They sort of disavow some of the more brutal tactics that ISIL uses or ISIS uses. So now we're in the 2013 time period. A fascinating moment in ISIS's history for me is a jailbreak that happened last summer, and I just remember reading about it. It happened at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and an enormous number of Al-Qaeda fighters, it was supposed to be around 500 to 600 Al-Qaeda operatives, were broken out of this jail. And I remember it didn't get a lot of play at the time, but I remember reading the headline and thinking, like, holy smokes, that sounds awful, and that's going to come back to haunt us. And then it sort of fell off the radar, and that was that. But I think it was a crucial moment for the group in terms of gaining power in Iraq. So it's 2013. The violence in both Iraq and Syria are at staggering levels. I remember last fall, there were very few reporters or Western reporters still with bureaus in Iraq and still covering what was going on there. But I remember the AFP bureau were one of the few that kind of stayed behind, and their reports of the number of bombings were just, incredible. And it really wasn't gaining much attention here. I don't think many people were paying that much attention to it because we no longer had U.S. troops there. So that brings us to January 2014. The beginning of this year, when ISIS pushes into Iraq, sort of with a string of sudden victories, taking Fallujah, and then in June it seizes Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq. And this is when it really kind of registers on the broader public's radar, I think, and in many ways wakes up the Obama administration to what's happening there. And it appears that they're ready to march on Baghdad. At that point is when the U.S. response really starts to kick in. In June, the Pentagon sent, I should say too, at that point they also rebrand themselves again to the Islamic State, which describes their ambitions and what they intend to set up in the region. At this point, the Pentagon sends in a few hundred military advisors. That number sort of steadily ticks up over the summer. There are now 1,600 advisors on the ground, and that's just the public number. It's widely believed that there are more special forces and CIA elements working there. And then fast forward to August 8th. I think it was August 7th that the president actually came out in front of the American public and announced that he was ready to conduct airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Iraq. They were threatening the town of Sinjar, where a group of, now I'm forgetting the name of the group.
Yazidis?
The Yazidis were being threatened with genocide by the Islamic State. They'd been chased sort of up onto this mountain and were stranded there. At the same time, Erbil, where the U.S. has a consulate and a lot of staff and is a part of Iraqi Kurdistan, was also being threatened. The Mosul Dam, which is a huge strategic asset, they'd also taken hold of. So all of these things together pushed the Obama administration into action, and they began airstrikes in Iraq in early August. And then they began airstrikes in Syria just last week. In the meantime, this was mentioned in the introduction, but you had the series of beheadings of American hostages. First James Foley, and then Stephen Sotloff on September 2nd. And both of these events really galvanized, I think, the American public behind a war effort that kind of came out of nowhere. And it's believed that 2 more Americans are being held by the group, including a woman. And since then, a British aid worker, David Haynes, has also been killed. So after the hostages were beheaded, sort of the pressure was on the Obama administration, on the White House, and it became clear, and it became part of the discussion, that you can't destroy ISIS, which was the word that the White House was using, without attacking them in Syria as well. So all of a sudden, the attention shifted to Syria, where they're headquartered. And so airstrikes started there last Monday. I realize I haven't mentioned at all the government in Baghdad, which is sort of a key part of this, and the role of Maliki over the summer, the prime minister, who the U.S. wanted out. They wanted a new unified government to sort of bring in Sunni, the Sunni population who still felt disenfranchised by the Maliki government. In any event, that's sort of where we stand today. We're striking pretty much daily in Iraq. We're striking since last Monday, I'd say fairly daily in Syria. The White House has made it a priority to bring in international members into this coalition against ISIS. In Syria, they have 5 Arab partners that are involved in airstrikes there, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia doing the most in terms of actually dropping bombs along with the United States. And then a big question is, airstrikes will only go so far, so who's going to provide the ground force element in all of this, since the United States has said it won't be doing that. In Iraq, it's the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga, and we plan on training, I believe, a Sunni National Guard to contribute as well. And then in Syria is the issue of who on earth is going to, provide the ground forces there, where there's a raging civil war. There are Assad forces. There are Iranian militia on the ground. And so the White House has stated it plans on training an initial 5,000 Syrian moderate rebels that it plans on vetting so that it knows sort of who it's giving arms to, and that this force will eventually provide the ground force that can take advantage of our airstrikes there. So anyway, I think I'll leave it at that. I have no idea how long I've been talking. Feels like 2 hours. Please feel free if I've left out any key moments in time. I hope that made sense. And
right. Yeah, thanks, Kate. And thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me. It's good to be back. So I'm tempted to play the blame game, but I'm going to resist the temptation at least for a few minutes. So on September 10th, Obama gave his major ISIS address. And he said something that really stuck out for me. And when I heard it, I'm like, oh boy, we're in for it. He said that ISIS is a terrorist organization, pure and simple. That was his quote, but it's neither pure nor simple. And it really raises the question of, can we really effectively confront an enemy that we insist on mischaracterizing? And it's not just a semantic debate. It really does matter how we view ISIS. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of organization ISIS is, its motivations, its objectives. Now, what's really distinctive and revolutionary about ISIS is that it has a particular interest in governance. And this is different from the old style of terrorist groups in the early to mid-2000s, where there was a lot of blowing up and destroying, but there was no affirmative vision. ISIS actually has turned out to be surprisingly effective. Of course, it's a low bar in the Middle East, but surprisingly effective at running local administrations, providing social services, providing for some degree of law and order. And this is what makes them a different kind of threat, I would say a more frightening kind of threat. So when we kind of, in a way, talk about ISIS, they're fringe, they're terrorists, they're this, they're that, that's all true. ISIS, I think, by any reasonable standard, crosses the evil threshold. But I think by just portraying it as a terrorist group, we minimize the threat, we minimize the nature of the threat. Now, just to kind of go into this issue of the governance component, and I would recommend an article. It's one of the best articles that you can read on ISIS's governance strategy. This article, it's called Menbij and ISIS's Public Administration Strategy. It was published on Jihadology about a month ago. But anyway, it kind of looks at the case of Menbij, which is a small city in Aleppo province in Syria of about 100,000 people. It's been under ISIS rule, and the article discusses the perceptions of locals of ISIS's rule. And one thing that really comes through, that really struck me, is that while ISIS might be more brutal it's less arbitrary than most authoritarian regimes in the region. This is worth just kind of talking about for a second. So I've lived under several authoritarian regimes. Granted, I'm an American citizen, so I always have a kind of exit strategy if necessary. But I mean, one thing that's particularly frightening about authoritarian regimes is you don't really know where the red lines are. You don't know what's going to happen. The secret police can come to your house unannounced at dawn. So ISIS is a little bit different in that they're very brutal. They behead people and things like that. But there's a kind of consistency in their approach. The rules are fairly clear, and there's less corruption, at least compared to secular regimes in the Arab world. So as long as you kind of mind your own business and don't get involved in politics, or at least kind of pay lip service to ISIS, you'll probably be able to live and survive and all that. So that's one thing that makes ISIS, that leads ISIS to have more local public support than we might expect. And of course, I mentioned the fact that they actually run things fairly effectively. And when you're living kind of in a kind of chaotic security vacuum, even the most minimal level of security is going to be seen positively. So while the overwhelming majority of Syrians and Iraqis don't, of course, share ISIS's ideology and see it to be foreign and austere and quite brutal, we can't lose sight of this other side of what ISIS does. Now, this is important because the Obama administration has adopted a rather narrow counterterrorism strategy against what is not primarily a terrorist organization. So we have a problem. And it's also a very short-term approach. So another aspect of this is, if ISIS has been able to rise to prominence, at least in part because of the failure of governance, the failure of democratic processes, because of these political and security vacuums, then it is a little bit concerning and should give us pause that we're allying with some of the most repressive regimes in the region to fight ISIS. So it's this kind of endless loop that we find ourselves falling into, that repression is a contributing factor to the rise of extremism, but to fight extremism, we have to ally with repressive regimes. When do we and how do we break the cycle? That's the short term. We have to obviously work with repressive regimes in the short term, but what's concerning is that Obama hasn't laid out anything resembling a broader long-term vision. And if you look at his various speeches and statements on ISIS, including his September 10th speech, I did a Control F just to make sure. He didn't mention the word democracy once, for example. So that is, I think, is going to be more of a problem when we start to think about where are we going to be 3, 5, 10 years from now. There's also, I think, an interesting debate going on now about, was ISIS trying to intentionally goad us into greater involvement? And it's a bit of a longer discussion. We'll just table that. But I think the more relevant question for us now is, does ISIS stand to benefit from greater U.S. involvement, regardless of what their original intentions were? And I supported, and I do support, at least in the theoretical sense, the idea of airstrikes in both Iraq and Syria. But I think we're going about it in perhaps the worst possible way, and I'll kind of close with that a little bit. It's actually been somewhat remarkable to me, and it's almost maybe the right awe-inspiring, I suppose, to watch what's happened over the past week. And it's almost, if someone had asked me, Shadi, what kind of airstrike strategy would we need to adopt in order to alienate as many of our supposed local allies in Syria as possible in the shortest amount of time, I would have said, do exactly what the Obama administration has done the past 7 days. It's an interesting question as to how they could have come up with such a strategy. I'll leave the psychologizing for another time. But within a day of the launching of airstrikes in Syria, the vast majority of rebel groups were denouncing U.S. airstrikes, even U.S.-funded rebels. So forget about the ones that are more Islamist, that are a little bit more radical. Fine, it's to be expected that they would oppose U.S. airstrikes for one reason or another. But the fact that You had groups like Harakat Hazm, for example, which has been one of the major forces that we've been backing with US money, felt the need, felt compelled to pretty strongly criticize American policy, was a big red flag within 24 hours. And the reasons there are quite obvious is that, and I should also mention General Dempsey's remarks at Congress. And again, this was another moment where I was listening to General Dempsey. It's like, did he actually say that? But he did. He was essentially saying that we're going to train these 5,000 Syrian fighters to fight ISIS and not Assad. The Assad regime part of it would be deferred until some later point after the ISIS threat was addressed. And Senator McCain, and for all of his faults, I think he was very right to raise this question to Dempsey at the hearing, that Dempsey was fundamentally mischaracterizing and misunderstanding the motivations of the Free Syrian Army. You're going to ask people whose very raison d'etre is to fight the Assad regime and tell them, we're going to fund you, we're going to train you, but don't worry about the Assad regime, worry about ISIS. So this is where I think strategic objectives become very important. Is the goal to simply degrade ISIS's capabilities in Syria, or is it to defeat ISIS? I would argue that to defeat ISIS, you have to address the big elephant in the room, one of the root causes of ISIS's rise to prominence, which is the brutality of the Assad regime. And the fact that there is no strategy on what to do about the Assad regime, there's no endgame, is incredibly problematic. So we're essentially launching airstrikes with the most gaping hole imaginable in our strategy. No one knows what our Syria strategy is, including the very people that we will have to depend on the ground in Syria to fight ISIS. And this is where I'll just indulge very briefly in the blame game, is that, so if we want to understand the rise of ISIS, ISIS would have existed regardless. As Kate, I think, laid out, it was going to be there in some form. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is what policies contributed to the rise of ISIS to such prominence? Because right now, ISIS is the dominant rebel group in Syria. And this is where, so if you have a situation where it's a zero, at least in some parts of Syria, it's a zero-sum game between the Assad regime and ISIS, naturally, if you target ISIS without having a serious, coherent plan to boost moderate rebels, then naturally, Assad is going to benefit. And that's actually one of the reasons that the French, who are usually the most interventionist on Syria, are actually decided not to participate in airstrikes in Syria, in part because of this concern that we may end up inadvertently benefiting the Syrian regime. So that's a bit of a problem. And lastly, I'll just close with this, and to try to kind of offer a broader context and something which I think isn't mentioned as much as it should be, is that right now ISIS is essentially saying to the Muslim world that the objective of an Islamic State, the objective of an Islamic caliphate cannot be achieved through the democratic process. It cannot be achieved through peaceful means. And this is where the first 3 years of the Arab Spring become very important, because this is when there was an opportunity with mainstream Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, that are Islamist, deeply conservative, and have a particular vision for their societies, but they were committed to working within democratic processes. And that was a potential model that we had to work with. Even if we didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood, at least they were working within a process. But time and time again, the existing secular state order in the Middle East has failed to accommodate the participation of mainstream Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. So ISIS's narrative has been strengthened immeasurably because of this. And they say, look at Egypt. There was a military coup against a democratically elected Islamist government. And they point to any number of other examples. We can talk about Yemen, where Houthi rebels just took over the capital. And again, the message there is you achieve power through force. So if we're trying to kind of take a step back and understand what's going on here, violence seems to work in the Middle East. It has worked pretty effectively over the last 3 years, and that's the context in which groups like ISIS have been able to rise. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, folks, and thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here, and happy to meet Kate and Shadi. As you heard in the introduction, I cover transnational threats. I spend a lot of time overseas interviewing everyone along the spectrum of militancy, from the militants, insurgents, terrorists, through people who support them, and then a range of other folks who are studying them, and then people trying to counter them, to try and get all different perspectives on what's happening. We're covering all sides of this. What I'll talk to you about a little bit in the notes will be U.S. policy and strategy, and we've heard some comments already about it. Not so complimentary, but I wouldn't find much to disagree with, though I will disagree with a couple points. And then talk about 3 key elements of the ISIS success: safe havens, financing or funding, and then foreign fighters that I think are very, very tough nuts to crack. We'll talk about the elements of why they're so difficult, and then talk about potential responses. And I'm happy to try to answer questions about a lot of other things. So policy side, and we have heard a little bit about this already, but without a doubt, pushing hard on political reform. You can't want it more than they do, right? You can't want their country to be one piece, Iraq I'm talking about, to have integrity, to have inclusion, unless they're doing it. It was a significant victory by the Obama administration, who had help, parentheses, Iran, in getting Maliki out. That was a significant accomplishment, because that was the wedge driving Sunni communities into the arms of ISIS, or at least making them neutral. So very, very important to get out Maliki and get al-Abadi in. But I would say there's excess enthusiasm over Abadi and what this means. What was it, the former Alan Greenspan talked about irrational exuberance. I think there's a little bit of irrational exuberance over this political reform. What have we done? I mean, where are we at this point? Are all of those Sunni generals back in the military, with the loyalists who didn't want to fight gone? Are the people who were ejected from the country, who were imprisoned, who were marginalized, are they back in the game? Are those National Guard units set up? Are there pensions back in play for those Sunni fighters and those who joined the awakening with the United States forces to get rid of al-Qaeda in Iraq? Nope, that's not there yet. So a little bit of excess exuberance right now, but nonetheless, that is absolutely key. We, broadly speaking, will not succeed until that happens. And it provided ISIS with one of its 2 biggest advantages, and that was Maliki. And getting rid of him again was an incredible step. Solving Assad, as we also heard earlier, is not on the table right now. And I've got to say, trying to weave our way to success around all of these obstacles, the Turks, Saudi point of view, the Iranian point of view, what to do about Assad, how to convince people who are geared towards fighting him to fight ISIS and training them, is really a remarkable thing to do. Shrinking the operating space, that's probably ISIS' second big advantage. The first one having been Maliki and the residual effects of that marginalization of Sunnis. So shrinking the operating space, they have a safe haven where they can train, where they can operate, where they can raise and manage funds, propagandize, recruit locals and foreign fighters, and house them. And also, now that they've declared a caliphate, they have sacred land which they can call others to come and defend. That is a huge motivation. Whether you believe it or not, that young guy coming from Indonesia, coming from Somalia, coming from the United States, believes he is going there to defend sacred land. It's a huge motivator. What else should we be doing? Targeting senior leadership. Now, this is on the kinetic side. There's no doubt about it. When you kill or capture senior leadership, especially a lot of folks around them, it is highly disruptive, but ephemeral. You do have to continue the battle and follow up on that. Airstrikes have been effective. They are hard to do, and especially without folks on the ground. One of the key things we're missing, of course, is that intelligence community footprint. We have it with overhead, satellites, drones, et cetera, but it's no substitute for having guys on the ground, ears and eyes on the ground, and having a network that we can tap into that is a reliable network. Empower and support the brutes that are already on the ground. That is what we're trying to do with the Iraqi security forces in the Peshmerga, and then to begin planning for the next set, what I call the proxy boots, and this is the moderate opposition. That's going to be the biggest lift if we even get there. But let's also think about those people we're trying to empower. ISAF, ISF, Iraqi Security Forces, we spent $25 billion training and equipping them. And you may remember the Inspector General reports for Iraq coming out saying, oh my God, we've got 26 brigades and one of them is battle ready. And then maybe we had 3.5 and just a few of them over the years battle ready. I think we really put lipstick on a pig here when we said, yep, they're ready to go, let's send them off. Without a doubt, I think we understood that they were incapable. In April of this year, there were 6 Iraqi divisions in the west on the border watching ISIS move about and doing nothing to interdict them. Only Iraqi special ops were engaging them at that point in that area, a key area. These guys were not doing. Why? Maliki takes over the military, kicks out the Sunnis, assigns senior positions to Shia loyalists. Loyalists are only thinking about how to make money in their position, how to sell promotions, not to fight, not to protect. Okay, that's much of what has happened on inside, and that is incredibly dangerous. Contesting the ideological space, and I know when we spoke earlier, Shadi, you would speak about this, about some of the religious, theological, and ideological elements of this. Working with credible Muslim voices across the world to counteract the ISIS message. Look, we're the country with Madison Avenue. We can tell and essentially move everyone in this crowd to choose a particular type of clothing to buy, food, how to look with your hair, what car to buy. We can influence so much of a consumer's decisions, but we do an unbelievably poor job at influencing people in these ideas. Okay, we're not the ones to do it. Absolutely. The second part of this, the 3 key pieces, and I would be happy to go into these in much more detail. The safe havens, the ungoverned space that has been defined as sacred and is a resource-rich place. This is where they plot, they launch, they recover. And by safe haven, I don't just mean Syria and Iraq. I mean over the border in Turkey, which has been highly accommodating, though less so recently. I went down to the border in January, interviewed fighters from 4 different groups, went to the hospitals, went to the NGOs, saw the places where these guys rest and recuperate, interviewed passport traffickers, all in the open. All in the open, these guys are there. And these are not just Free Syrian Army, these are hardline guys who are down on that border. So the safe haven is quite big. And let's not forget about virtual safe havens, the social media and the internet where these guys operate with unbelievable efficacy. Terror finance. I believe that ISIS thought this way ahead of time. They thought, look, we're going to be in it for the long haul. We've got a big battle ahead of us. Do we want a funding leash on us from the Gulf or further afield? So when the U.S. starts to exert pressure on people funding ISIS, they yank that funding back? No way. Let's build a portfolio of durable funding resources inside the country that we're taking over. Oil, granaries, selling antiquities, kidnap for ransom, extortion, taxation. Let's get all of our supplies. What do the preppers want to do? They want to go to some little corner on the side of a hill, make sure they have their own water, their own energy. They want to be off the grid. ISIS is off the funding grid to some degree. They have to get it locally. The thing is, even though they're pulling in a huge amount of money, anywhere from $1 to $4 million a day on the oil, the burn rate is unbelievably high. When you grab this kind of territory and you depend on these tribes and Sunni groups and former Saddam army loyalists and lots of others, you need money to grease those wheels. So they burn through it very, very quickly, which is why the airstrikes that have gone after the mobile refinery capability, very important, because that's the #1 source of funding. Very, very important there. Foreign fighters coming in with a full head of steam. These guys are absolutely motivated. Why are they motivated? Lots of things. The sacred land issue. But most of these guys, many of these guys, are coming from places where they are highly marginalized, politically, socially, economically. There are demographic problems in many of these countries are coming from where they have no opportunity, where there's underemployment, and they don't have a sense of dignity. They're coming from places with dictatorships where they've had their dignity stripped in many ways, though they do come from the U.S. There's no sense of empowerment, purpose, and they're coming from nothing, and ISIS is saying, we are going to make something out of you. And they give them all of these attributes: what happens when they go back home for the ones that make it back home? Are they going to go back to being nothing? They have street cred. They know how to surveil and counter-surveil, build bombs, network. They have incredible friends now at this point and skills. They represent a significant threat. I will say, and caveat that though, we thought there would be a huge blowback from the Iraq War for foreign fighters that went then in fewer numbers. That shoe never dropped in a big way. So don't overblow the foreign fighter threat, but they are coming from 80 countries. They are coming to a place that they see as a sacred territory. So we have higher motivation, bigger numbers, and a lot of other factors going on that I think makes them a problem. So let's break there or turn back to Kate to MC it at this point.
Okay, great. Lots of things to think about. I want to start with, you brought up General Dempsey's comment about how the rebels won't fight the Assad regime with our training immediately. And I was remembering that I was watching a State Department briefing just last week, or it might have been the week before that, where the State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf was asked the same question, and she said that they would be, which brings to mind that the administration's messaging on its strategy, on the threat that ISIS poses, has been really all over the place. You've heard everything from the vice president saying we're going to chase them to the gates of hell, to John Kerry, like the next day, said we're not at war with them. The triple D words that always get thrown around, defeat, destroy, degrade. Sometimes we're destroying them, sometimes we're degrading them. What is the reason behind, or what's the confusion behind the administration's messaging, not just to the global audience, but to here at home? What do you think the reason is behind it? Is it that the strategy is improvisational, or is it something else going on?
Yeah. Well, the other interesting use of words is we will ultimately defeat ISIS, and ultimately could be in like 50 years or something. So, it's been hard for me. So this administration has struggled with messaging on the Middle East, really from day one. And in part because we have the falling apart of the old order with the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011. And we had been oriented for 50 years, oriented around autocratic regimes. We had a certain way of doing business, and all of that started to fall apart, and we were kind of stuck in between the kind of old realpolitik and then on the other hand, this desire to prioritize reform and democracy and to support the protesters in the region. So I think you've always seen this kind of tension with the Obama administration, but I think also this is an administration that feels it has to do something but really doesn't want to do something. So, I mean, Obama has made very clear, whenever he talks about the Middle East, you get the sense he really doesn't want to be here. He just wants to leave and do something else.
Pivot to Asia.
Yeah. There's really a sense that he's been forced into this, but I think instinctually, he doesn't want to commit ground forces. He doesn't want to have a heavier footprint, certainly in Syria, and he's been resisting greater involvement in Syria since early 2012. And even the 60 Minutes interview, he was still kind of holding to this line that it was, I think he used the word mythology, to think that if we had backed the moderate rebels 2 years ago, that it would have made much of a difference. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because that's what we're doing now, but if he's saying that if we had done that 2 years ago and it wouldn't have made a difference, and how does it make a difference now? So even on things like that, it just doesn't make sense. So I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of buck passing to the next administration. This is going to be the next administration's problem. But I think unfortunately, and it's sad to be quite honest, that Obama will be haunted by this. And I think that his legacy, at least on foreign policy, will be defined by the failure to address this threat. And we won't be able to undo the damage. And this is, I think, what people sometimes, I think, don't fully grasp. It's never going to be the same again. Iraq and Syria will never be what they were before. And also, now that ISIS has removed the mental block of establishing a caliphate, anytime there's a piece of territory that's ungoverned, an extremist group is going to be thinking to itself, oh, why don't we establish an Islamic emirate? Before ISIS, the idea of establishing a caliphate was so weighty. The caliphate is such a powerful idea in Islamic history. Even the most ambitious extremist groups were like, we're not going to mess with that. We might kind of allude to it, but we're not actually going to make that jump. Now that ISIS has made that jump, we can never take that back.
Two very brief reflections on that. Just because we are not doing something well, whether it's airstrikes or some other policy, does not mean that other choices would have turned out better. So when we observe a poor execution in something, doesn't mean there was a better choice. Could mean that it was the best choice we had, and it's still unbelievably difficult to do. Another thing I would just think about, what if our proxy team loses against ISIS? No one's talking about that. They're just talking about training and equipping them and setting them against ISIS. What if they lose? Then they don't have a chance to go and fight Assad. That's another consideration.
My sense is that the military knows what it's up against. There's no sort of, they're not living in a fantasy land where this all makes sense and this works. And some of the officials I've talked to have, said to me, you can't have a military strategy without a political endgame in mind. And that is, the political end state is, somewhat articulated in Iraq, but completely missing, as you said, in Syria. So I was wondering if you could talk, if both of you could talk about, first of all, is there a conceivable political endgame at the moment in Syria? What would it look like, and how risky or how doomed to fail is our military strategy without one?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you say, in Iraq, it's a little bit, there is something there. We know what the basic contours of the strategy are now. That's different than saying that it's working, because it's been 8 weeks of airstrikes, and while ISIS has been repelled from gaining more territory, it hasn't really lost any territory, and actually up until just yesterday, it's been able to, at least in some parts of Iraq, actually capture new towns. So this is very suggestive, I think, that despite US airstrikes, despite having a better Iraqi government, ISIS is still incredibly hard to deal with militarily. And you still have a situation where Iraqi soldiers are just scared to confront ISIS. In part, and I think, Tom, you touched on this, we're living in a time where ideology goes a long way, and I think it's just worth, if I could just for a second, just say something about ideology and the kind of religious motivations. In the fall of Mosul, the Iraqi army and police forces had more than 30,000 people. ISIS had, less than 1,000, and they were able to capture Mosul. Now just think about that for a second, 800 versus 30,000. And something similar happened in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. You had a few thousand Houthi fighters, and they were able to, with very little resistance, just go into the Yemeni capital. And keep in mind, the Yemeni security forces and military have been backed by the U.S. for several years. So we have a similar situation that despite all of our security assistance, they saw this small group of ideological fighters, and the resistance simply dissipated. And this is what I worry about, that you can't, there's no substitute for the kind of cohesion and morale that ideology offers you. And some of you may have seen the official ISIS spokesman, Adnani. He said this the Sunday before last. He made an interesting comment that if we win, great. But even if we die trying, we've still won. And we seek death, and many ISIS fighters have said this. Now, I take them at their word. It's hard for us as Americans to really, do they really mean that they're actually, that they seek death? I've spent less time with militants, but even with mainstream Islamist groups, I think it would be a mistake to kind of project our kind of American sensibilities and say they're just instrumentalizing religion. No, it's deeply and honestly felt. And this is where I think the religious motivations of ISIS makes them, very difficult to deal with. And we're not really situated from the USG standpoint to really fight that battle of ideas. Do we know much about caliphates? Do we know what to say about that? And while I said before that the vast majority of Muslims don't agree with ISIS's ideology, ISIS was very smart from a marketing standpoint because they knew the kind of resonance that the word caliphate would have. And that's maybe a bigger discussion, but even myself growing up as an American Muslim in a somewhat secularized town in Pennsylvania, the idea of a caliphate is something that you heard growing up, that we as Muslims used to be the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, and then we entered into one of the most precipitous declines in human history. And I think to understand the broader context, the kind of humiliation and the sense of historical loss that fuels groups like ISIS, we have to understand that there are a lot of Arabs and Muslims throughout the world. They might be secular, liberal, Islamist, radical, whatever, but they're all at least thinking about this question of how did we go from there, the greatness of the Abbasid Empire, for example, to where we are now.
Which are things the president touched on in his Cairo speech.
Yeah.
He highlighted all of the accomplishments in Muslim and Arab history, and it was quite smart to do. I would commend that speech if you have a chance to look at it. To answer your question, Kate, I think the clear interest here is to exert some leverage on Assad through a victory by the moderates against ISIS. It's certainly what our Gulf partners are hoping for. Hey, if we're going to go after Sunni forces, we Sunnis are going to go after Sunni extremists that we otherwise might think are a proxy to defeat Shia forces, there better be something coming for us, which is turning the screws on Assad. The political solution potentially being Assad leaves under a managed transition for a government that's more inclusive, a la what we're trying to accomplish in Iraq. Getting there, again, is weaving our way through an unbelievable obstacle course. Very, very difficult to get there. But again, what if that proxy force loses and we don't have them as an exertion against Assad? He's doing a very smart thing. He is trying to destroy the moderate opposition so that he can cement a binary choice for the world and for us. It's us or it's ISIS. So we're going to hit the guys in Aleppo, we're going to hit the guys in Idlib, we're going to push moderates to the side of ISIS, and there will not be any middle ground here. And that means he's removing a cudgel we can use against him. And I think that's an effective policy, and he's on the ground. He gets to execute it. He may be manpower weak, but he has Hezbollah to protect his rear, and he still has Iranian support, of course. We have a lot of disadvantages.
So Tom, you brought up my last and final question before we go to the audience, which is looking at this coalition. First of all, is it not all it's cracked up to be? Already there are questions. The Pentagon is, from my point of view, the Pentagon is, making every effort it can to highlight when the UAE or Saudi Arabia is actually dropping bombs in Syria and sort of making a point of this so that we all know that they're involved. And maybe not so broad as the coalition itself, because there are all sorts of countries involved that kind of have nothing to do with this. But looking more closely at the region and the regional partners that are at play, where are the coalition's weaknesses? What are the calculations on behalf of some of these Gulf countries, Turkey, and then also Iran? If you could just both maybe address, I've left it kind of broad, but where you see this coalition falling apart or playing a bigger role? What do you think?
Sure. I mean, first of all, yes, it is not what it's all cracked up to be, and no coalition ever is. I mean, look at World War II. We were close, very close with the British, but they still complained an awful lot about what we're doing. And in every alliance, you're going to have that. Mm-hmm. This alliance is an engineer's nightmare of moving parts of questionable quality with not a lot of lubrication. All right. So this is to get this thing to operate in sequence cooperatively is going to be really, really difficult to do. Everything with Turkey is a negotiation. They are on their back heels in some ways because of the bad relationships they have in the region. Yet Erdogan is, successfully won his 8th election. He sees himself very much as a leader. And their issue with Kurds in the northeast of Syria is a big issue for us to, not exert pressure on him through airstrikes that defend them, and they have ISIS on their doorstep right now with tanks against AK-47s. The Saudis, again, in the Gulfies, if I can use that term, are again looking for an ultimate advantage against the Iranians. They see a Shia crescent from Beirut with Hezbollah to Damascus with Assad to Baghdad with the Shia leadership, all the way to Qum and Tehran. That's pretty formidable from them, even though Shias make up 12 to 15% of Islam across the world. They are quite fearful. So they want something to come out in the end here that they can benefit from. And again, taking down a Sunni extremist group, which admittedly is also targeting ultimately Saudi Arabia, because they see Saudi Arabia as corrupt and illegitimate as custodians of the two holy places. So they ultimately do want something to come of this. One, a stronger relationship with the U.S. The president has not done a good job of establishing personal relationships, which are absolutely essential. And I know Shadi knows that 10 times better than I do. Those relationships are not there. This does give us a chance to lead in a way and establish those personal relationships and make sure the coalition is strong enough to hold together. The Europeans are afraid, there's no doubt about it, about blowback. 3,000 of the anywhere from 12 to 15,000 foreign fighters are from Europe. And let's not forget, of the 38 visa waiver countries where people don't need to get an interview at the U.S. Embassy to travel to America, 30 of them are in Europe. Okay, so there's fear about blowback into Europe as well. The coalition's imperfect. It's going to be tough to make work. But if you lead, people love it when America leads. Yes, they'll complain about cracking China, but in a China shop, not China, the country. But where we lead, people follow. Okay, and they will complain, but you know what? They will still follow because they don't want to be the flak magnet. We're out in front.
Actually, I agree with Tom.
Okay. Anything to add?
I mean, just one thing so this issue of personal relationships in the Gulf is very important. So I lived in Qatar for 4 years and traveled in the Gulf quite a bit. And one thing, I mean, it's really hard to overstate the degree of distrust people in the Gulf have for Obama. They think that Obama just doesn't have skin in the game. He doesn't want to be involved in the Middle East. So there's always a question that when the U.S. leads, is it really serious? Is it committed? Is it in there for the long haul? And you can't really overcome that distrust very quickly, and that's been building over the last 6 years for a variety of reasons, and some of it was going to be inevitable, but I don't think that Obama really took care to nurture those relationships, and now that's why it's been such a kind of, pulling out toenails. I mean, all of our allies, the 5 Arab allies, have been very, very reluctant to get involved.
Lots to think about, and thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.